At some point tonight, in a house or an apartment or a room somewhere, a light will go out, and a person who functions perfectly well in ordinary life will feel something that does not quite make rational sense. It might be a mild unease, a slight heightening of attention, a feeling that the space around them has become less certain. Or it might be more significant than that, a reluctance to look toward a particular corner of the room, an impulse to check what is behind the door, a sense of something watching from the dark that the rational mind dismisses, but the body continues to register. The heart rate elevates slightly, the hearing sharpens, the eyes widen and strain toward the edges of vision. None of this is unusual. Fear of the dark is one of the most universal human experiences. Studies of fear across cultures consistently find that darkness ranks among the most common fear triggers in children and remains significantly more aversive than light conditions in adults, even when the adults fully understand that they are in a safe environment. The fear does not require a reason to be present. It is there before the reason arrives, before the mind has had time to assess the situation, before any particular threat has been identified. It is, in a fundamental sense, prior to reason. And that priority, that temporal and cognitive precedence of the fear over the reasoning that might justify or dismiss it, is the first clue to what fear of the dark actually is and where it comes from. The evolutionary psychologist Isaac Marks at King's College London, who spent decades studying the evolutionary origins of human fears and phobias, proposed in his landmark 1987 book, Fears, Phobias, and Rituals, that many of the most common and most persistent human fears are not learned responses to dangerous experiences, but are preparedness responses, biases toward certain fear objects that were shaped by natural selection because those objects reliably predicted real threats in the ancestral environment. Marx drew on the preparedness theory of phobias, developed by the psychologist Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania in a landmark 1971 paper. Seligman observed that human phobias are not randomly distributed across all possible fear objects, but cluster around a specific set of stimuli: heights, enclosed spaces, social rejection, blood, and darkness, among others. And that these stimuli have in common the property of having represented genuine threats to survival and reproduction in the ancestral environment. Seligman proposed that human beings are biologically prepared to acquire fears of these stimuli rapidly and to maintain them persistently, because ancestral individuals who rapidly acquired and persistently maintained these fears were more likely to survive. The darkness fits this framework with particular clarity. For the entirety of human evolutionary history, and for the evolutionary history of the primate lineage that preceded it, the night represented a specific and serious threat environment. Human beings are diurnal animals, meaning they are adapted for activity during the day and for rest during the night. The sensory systems of the human body are optimized for daytime conditions. Vision, the primary sense through which human beings navigate and monitor the environment for threats, is dramatically reduced in effectiveness in low-light conditions. The visual cortex processes high-resolution color vision during the day, but in darkness is reduced to peripheral, low-resolution monochromatic vision that provides far less information about what is present in the environment. This sensory reduction matters because the predators that posed the most significant threats to human ancestors were predominantly nocturnal. The leopard, which is probably the most significant predator of human ancestors in the African savanna environment, is a largely nocturnal hunter whose vision in low-light conditions is substantially better than that of humans. Lions hunt predominantly at night. Hyenas are more active at night than during the day. In every case, the reduced visual acuity of humans in darkness, combined with the enhanced visual acuity of the predators that hunted them, meant that darkness represented a systematic shift in the power relationship between human ancestors and the animals that could kill them. The anthropologist Donna Hart at the University of Missouri and the primatologist Robert Sussman at Washington University in St. Louis made this case compellingly in their 2005 book, Man the Hunted: Primates, Predators, and Human Evolution. Hart and Sussman argued against the dominant narrative that human evolutionary history was primarily characterized by our ancestors as hunters, and proposed instead that for most of the Pleistocene, the ancestors of modern humans were prey as well as predators, and that many features of human psychology, including heightened vigilance, coalition building, and fear responses to predator-associated stimuli, are best understood as adaptations to the experience of being hunted, rather than simply to the experience of hunting. On this account, Fear of the dark is not simply a childhood stage to be grown out of, or a vestigial response that served a function our ancestors needed, but that we no longer require. It is a functional alarm system, calibrated over millions of years of exposure to genuine nocturnal predation risk, that activates in the absence of visual information about the environment. The darkness itself is not what is feared. What is feared is what darkness conceals. The neuroscience of how this fear activates illuminates why it has the character it does, appearing before the reasoning mind has had time to assess the situation and persisting despite rational reassurance. The neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux at New York University, whose research on the neural mechanisms of fear has been foundational in the field, documented in his landmark 1996 book, The Emotional Brain, that the fear response is mediated primarily by the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure in the temporal lobe that serves as the brain's threat detection system. The amygdala receives sensory information through two distinct pathways: a fast, direct pathway from the thalamus that allows rapid threat response before the sensory information has been fully processed by the cortex, and a slower, indirect pathway through the cortex that provides more detailed and accurate assessment of the threat. The fast thalamic pathway, which LeDoux described as the low road, activates the amygdala and initiates the fear response before the cortex has had time to determine whether the threat is real. This means that in darkness, where visual information is degraded and uncertain, the amygdala responds to the absence of clear information about the environment by activating the fear response as a precautionary measure. The logic of the system is, when you cannot see clearly what is around you, assume that something threatening might be there, and prepare accordingly. The evolutionary logic behind this precautionary response is straightforward. In an environment where genuine predators were present and were capable of killing you if they ambushed you in the dark, the cost of false positives, of being afraid when there was nothing to be afraid of, was relatively low. You were briefly frightened for no reason. The cost of false negatives, of not being afraid when there was genuinely something in the dark, could be fatal. Natural selection, therefore, strongly favored a system biased toward false positives, toward treating darkness as threatening even in the absence of specific evidence of threat. This asymmetry between the costs of false positives and false negatives is the core evolutionary logic underlying not just fear of the dark, but the entire architecture of the human fear system. Anxious ancestors survived more often than fearless ones, not because anxiety is always right, but because the consequences of being wrong in the direction of fearlessness were so much worse than the consequences of being wrong in the direction of fearfulness. The developmental psychologist Karen Adolph at New York University has studied the development of fear of the dark in children and found that it typically emerges around the age of 2 to 3 years, at a developmental period when children are becoming more mobile and more independent, and therefore genuinely more exposed to the kinds of dangers that dark environments might conceal. The fear peaks in middle childhood and gradually declines across adolescence and adulthood in most individuals, although significant residual fear of dark environments persists into adulthood in a substantial minority of the population. The clinical psychologist Rachman at the University of British Columbia, who spent decades studying the acquisition and treatment of phobias, documented that fear of the dark shows a very different learning profile from many other learned fears. Most fears are acquired through direct experience, through conditioning by a genuinely frightening event, or through observational learning, through watching others respond with fear to a particular stimulus. Fear of the dark, by contrast, appears to require very little in the way of conditioning experience to develop, and is extremely resistant to extinction through exposure and reassurance. These properties are consistent with Seligman's preparedness theory. Prepared fears are acquired easily and extinguished slowly, because they tap into biological systems that were shaped by selection to be robust and persistent. The anthropologist David Samson at the University of Toronto has contributed a different but complementary perspective on the relationship between darkness and human psychology through his research on human sleep, and specifically on what makes human sleep distinctive compared to the sleep of our closest primate relatives. Samson and his colleagues have documented that human beings have the shortest sleep duration of any great ape species, averaging approximately 7 hours per night, compared to 9 to 10 hours for chimpanzees and gorillas. They have also documented that human beings spend a higher proportion of their total sleep time in rapid eye movement sleep, the sleep stage associated with dreaming, and with the memory consolidation and emotional processing functions that REM sleep appears to serve. Samson proposes that the evolution of shorter but more efficient sleep in humans may be connected to the threat environment of the ancestral sleeping context. Hominins who slept on the ground rather than in trees, as early humans apparently did for much of their evolutionary history, were exposed to nocturnal predators in a way that tree-sleeping primates were not. This exposure may have created selection pressure for lighter, more easily interrupted sleep, and for higher arousal thresholds that allowed rapid waking in response to threats. The result is a human sleep profile that is shorter and lighter than would be expected for a primate of our size, potentially reflecting the integration of predator vigilance into the sleeping state itself. This account of human sleep connects to the broader argument about darkness and predation risk. The night was not simply a time when humans could not see. It was a time when the biological systems associated with threat detection remained partially active even during sleep, maintaining a degree of vigilance against the nocturnal threats that made the dark hours genuinely dangerous for most of human evolutionary history. The contemporary experience of fear of the dark, the unease in an unlighted room, the reluctance to look into dark corners, the amplification of sounds in the absence of visual information, can all be understood as the surface expression of this deep evolutionary history. The systems that were calibrated for a world of genuine nocturnal predators are running in an environment where those predators are absent, producing experiences that feel irrational from the perspective of the conscious, reasoning mind, but that make complete sense from the perspective of the ancient threat detection system that is generating them. The philosopher of mind Andy Clark at the University of Edinburgh has proposed a framework for understanding predictive cognition that is relevant here. Clark argues in his 2016 book, Surfing Uncertainty, that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, continuously generating models of what is likely to be true about the environment, and updating these models on the basis of incoming sensory information. When sensory information is degraded or absent, as it is in darkness, the predictive models that the brain generates become increasingly dominated by prior expectations rather than by current perceptual input. And the prior expectations that the human brain brings to dark environments are not neutral. They have been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary history, in which dark environments reliably contained things worth being afraid of. The brain in darkness is running a model of the world that was calibrated for a world in which darkness meant danger. And the fear that this model generates is not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The things you fear in the dark are mostly not there, but the system that fears them was built in a world where they often were. And that system, running in the dark of a bedroom in a city where the nearest leopard is in a zoo several miles away, cannot be easily told that its services are no longer required. It was built to persist. It was built to be hard to switch off. It was built to treat darkness as a signal that requires a response. And tonight, as it has every night of your life, it will do exactly what it was built to do. There is a specific and underexamined dimension of fear of the dark that connects to the social nature of human beings, and it has to do with the relationship between darkness and social isolation. Human beings are fundamentally social animals. The safety that our ancestors experienced was primarily the safety of the group. Being with other people, being able to see them and hear them and be seen and heard by them was one of the primary buffers against the threats of the ancestral environment. The group provided collective vigilance, collective defense, and the mutual monitoring that reduced the risk of predator attack. Being separated from the group, being alone in an environment where you could not detect the presence or location of other people, was associated with elevated threat. Darkness produces exactly this kind of social isolation, even when other people are physically present in the same space. When the lights go out, the continuous low-level monitoring of the social environment that human beings engage in during waking life is suddenly disrupted. You cannot see the faces of the people around you. You cannot read their expressions to assess whether they are registering threat. You cannot monitor the space around you for the presence of unfamiliar others. The rich social information environment of daylight, which provides constant reassurance about who is present and what they are doing, is suddenly reduced to the fragmentary information of sound and touch. The social psychologist Mark Schaller at the University of British Columbia, whose work on the behavioral immune system we examined in an earlier video in this series, has also studied the relationship between darkness and social cognition. Schaller and his colleagues found that darkness activates not only predator-related threat responses, but also heightened monitoring of the social environment, increased sensitivity to cues of social threat, and elevated prejudice toward outgroup members. Schaller's interpretation of this finding is that darkness activates a generalized threat response that is not specific to any particular type of threat, but reflects the broad increase in environmental uncertainty that darkness produces. In an uncertain environment, the threat detection systems of the brain become more sensitive across all dimensions, including the social dimension. The result is that people in dark environments are more suspicious, more socially vigilant, and more prone to perceiving threat from other people than people in well-lit environments. This effect has implications beyond individual psychology. It suggests that the social and interpersonal consequences of darkness extend well beyond the obvious effects of reduced visibility. The ancient connection between darkness and danger has shaped not just the individual fear response, but the entire social and cognitive ecology of the nighttime environment. The evolutionary biologist Christopher Camperio-Ciani at the University of Padua has proposed an account of the evolution of fear of the dark that emphasizes the role of individual differences in fear sensitivity and their relationship to reproductive success. Camperio-Ciani's research on the genetics and heritability of fear responses has found that there is substantial heritable variation in fear sensitivity, including fear of the dark, across human populations. This heritable variation is consistent with the view that fear sensitivity is a trait that has been subject to natural selection, and that the optimal level of fear sensitivity depends on the specific threat environment in which an individual develops. In high predation environments, higher fear sensitivity and stronger fear of the dark may be adaptive, motivating avoidance of the nocturnal threat environment and reducing exposure to predation risk. In lower predation environments, lower fear sensitivity may be adaptive, reducing the costs of excessive vigilance and allowing more efficient use of the nighttime hours for other activities. The heritable variation in fear sensitivity may reflect a balance between these competing pressures, maintaining a range of fear responses in the population that allows individuals to calibrate their responses to the specific threat environment they inhabit. The psychologist Lars-Göran Öst at Stockholm University has conducted extensive research on the treatment of specific phobias, including fear of the dark, and has documented that even severe fear of the dark responds well to exposure-based cognitive behavioral therapy, in which individuals are progressively exposed to increasingly dark environments, while the fear response is allowed to subside without avoidance. This treatment efficacy is consistent with the evolutionary account of fear of the dark. The fear system is designed to respond to genuine threats, and the system can be updated through experience to distinguish between environments where darkness genuinely predicts threat and environments where it does not. But the update is slow, and the underlying bias persists. Even after successful treatment of clinically significant fear of the dark, the residual heightening of attention and arousal in dark environments typically remains. The system is recalibrated rather than eliminated. The ancient signal is quieted, but not silenced. The neuroscientist Michael Davis at Yale University has spent decades studying the neuroscience of fear and anxiety, and has made an important distinction that is relevant to fear of the dark: the distinction between fear and anxiety. Fear, in Davis's account, is a response to a specific, identifiable, present threat. Anxiety is a response to diffuse, unidentifiable, or anticipated threat. The two states involve partially distinct neural systems, with fear mediated primarily by the central amygdala and anxiety mediated primarily by the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, a structure closely connected to the amygdala. Fear of the dark, Davis's framework suggests, is more accurately described as anxiety than as fear in the strict sense. The darkness does not present a specific, identifiable threat. It presents a generalized increase in uncertainty about the environment, a reduction in the information available to assess whether specific threats are present. This uncertainty activates the anxiety system rather than the fear system, producing the diffuse unease, heightened attention, and vigilance that characterize the experience of being in a dark environment, rather than the focused, specific fear response that would be triggered by actually seeing a predator. This distinction matters because it helps explain the particular quality of the experience of being afraid of the dark. It is not quite like being afraid of a specific thing. It is more like being in a state of heightened readiness for things that have not yet revealed themselves. The imagination runs ahead of perception, generating possible threats in the space that vision cannot illuminate. The creak of a floorboard becomes potentially significant. The sound of wind becomes potentially the sound of movement. The familiar room becomes potentially populated with things that should not be there. This is the ancestral brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. In the absence of clear visual information about the environment, generating threat predictions to maintain readiness for what the darkness might conceal. The things it generates are not there. But the system that generates them was built in a world where they sometimes were. And that is why the dark, even in the safety of a house in a city, even in full knowledge that there is nothing there, can still make the body feel otherwise. There is one final dimension of fear of the dark worth examining, and it is perhaps the most personally relevant to the experience of reading or watching this in the evening hours. The relationship between fear of the dark and the imagination has been studied by the psychologist Paul Harris at Harvard University, who has spent decades examining the role of imagination in the emotional life of children. Harris found that children's fear of the dark is substantially mediated by imagination, by the active generation of mental representations of entities and threats that the darkness might conceal, and that this imaginary dimension of the fear is not a failure of rationality, but a feature of the same imaginative capacity that underlies creativity, planning, and the ability to model possible futures. Harris's research found that children who are more imaginatively active are, on average, more afraid of the dark. Not because imagination is a source of irrationality, but because imagination is a tool for threat modeling, for generating representations of what might be present in an environment that cannot be directly perceived. The child who imagines monsters in the dark is using the same cognitive machinery that allows them to imagine solutions to problems, to plan for events that have not yet happened, and to understand the mental states of other people. The dark is, in this sense, the natural habitat of the imagination. In the absence of visual input, the predictive machinery of the brain runs on its prior models of what might be there rather than on current perceptual information. And the prior models that the human brain brings to dark environments, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary history and reinforced by cultural narratives about the dangers of the night, are not models of empty space. They are models of environments that might contain things worth being afraid of. The stories that human cultures tell about the dark reflect this. Every human culture has stories about dangerous things in the dark. Monsters, spirits, predators, malevolent beings that emerge at night and retreat with the dawn. These stories are not simply entertainment. They are cultural encodings of the ancient recognition that the night was genuinely dangerous, passed from generation to generation in narrative form long before the specific predators that made it dangerous had been forgotten. The cultural stories about darkness and the biological fear of darkness are two expressions of the same deep fact about the relationship between the human lineage and the nocturnal environment. The night was where the danger was, for a very long time, and the systems that learned to treat it that way have not fully unlearned the lesson. The light you leave on when you go to bed is not irrational. It is the contemporary expression of an adaptive response that kept your ancestors alive. And the part of you that still wants it on, even when the rational mind knows there is nothing in the dark, is not the primitive part of you that needs to be overcome. It is the ancient part of you that remembers what the dark used to mean, even though you no longer need to remember it. Even though the leopard is gone, the memory remains. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.